Don't forget that you can now listen to the Politicrat podcast on Audible at audible.com and wherever you get your podcasts. Please subscribe now. And thank you for your support. Welcome to the Politicrat. I'm Omar Moore. It is Wednesday, December the 9th, 2020. On this edition of the Politicrat, a conversation with Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter Leonora LaPeter Anton of the Tampa Bay Times. We will be talking about her latest story, written with two of her colleagues, about a nursing home in Seminole, Florida. The title of the story is Death at Freedom Square. You'll want to stay tuned for this conversation, and it's coming up next. On this podcast, I have said many times that it's important to really get to the people behind the numbers that we see when it comes to coronavirus and get to the human stories. It's so important that we do. And I think it's very important that we do that, especially now, but all the time. We see numbers, we get numb. But it's important to speak to people who have reported on the human beings behind these numbers. And one of the people who has done that is Leonora LaPeter Anton. She is a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist for the Tampa Bay Times, and she has written a story along with two other writers called Death at Freedom Square about a nursing home in Seminole, Florida, and some of the things that have gone on there. We're going to talk for a few minutes about that with Leonora LaPeter Anton. Thank you for being here, Leonora.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I have to say, this story just ripped my heart out. This is something that is going on in Florida, but it is going on everywhere else, it seems. There's a lot of this going on. It's a disturbing read. I do recommend that everybody read your December 3rd story. And we're going to talk about it for a few minutes. Can you first tell me a bit about Freedom Square in Seminole Pavilion? Can you talk a little bit about that, please, first?
So Freedom Square is a retirement complex with about 700 residents. It serves independent living, hospice, nursing home, assisted living. It's located in north about, I'd say, 20 miles north of St. Petersburg, something like that. And it's near Tampa, Florida. People pay an entry fee to go in there, and then they pay a monthly fee to live there. It's been around for a couple decades. It has a town square in the center of it, a gazebo, a clock tower. It's sort of real homey in the middle with ponds and stuff. But then it was in Pinellas County here, one of the first facilities to get hit really hard by the coronavirus. And ultimately, over the course from, April to July, 40 people died who lived there at least. So from the coronavirus. So we decided to write about it, what happened there. We realized it was happening all over the state. We realized that, the nursing home numbers were exploding all over the state. We could see that. I personally had my father in an assisted living memory care unit, and I was worried about it. And that was kind of one of the things I was like, what's going on in these places? I need to do this research for everybody, but also for me, because I need to understand what my father what these facilities are about and what's happening, and is it going to get in there? And so ultimately we decided to go to the one that was hit first and hardest in the county. And that's why we chose Freedom Square to write our story around.
I appreciate what you've just said. It's good to lay out that groundwork so that people have a contextual entry and understanding about where we are about to go, what we're about to go into here. I did want to look at 4 people, as you write about a number of people who die from this virus, and not just die from it. It's what the people at the Freedom Square, the institution, does that just really takes it just does something to you. So there's 4 people actually, and I want to get you to speak a little bit about them. You start with, I believe her name is Margaret Blackman, or Marjorie Blackman. She is somebody. Marjorie.
Mm-hmm.
And
Marjorie Blackman.
Right. Thank you very much for clarifying for me. And she was someone who was retiring or was about to retire. Can you talk about her story?
Sure. So Marjorie was 67 years old. She was an immigrant from Guyana. She'd come here in 1980, and in her 50s, she'd gone back to school to get a license to become a licensed practical nurse. She worked at Freedom Square for 15 years solid, and she really, her daughter told me that she could have retired actually, but she just loved her work so much that she wanted to go, and she just really enjoyed it. So she was there in April and started to get sick, and she came in one day with a fever and was sent home, and ultimately she ended up in a hospital on a ventilator, and she died a couple weeks later. But she took care of a lot of the people in the facility, and was, known by a lot of the families. A lot of people didn't even know she died, but, there was a lot of heartache over that because she was just such a good person, and she, just was so committed to her job at the facility. Right.
And that's the thing that really jumped out at me, that the first story about her, that, as you point out, she could have retired if she was about to, she wanted, but she loved that job so much. Her commitment to the job and to serving others and to helping others superseded her any kind of self-interest or anything else that she might have had. Right. That's the thing that really was poignant to me about her story. One of the things I wanted to ask you about this is, someone like that, she'd worked pretty much for a lot of her life in that facility, right? Or as a caregiver in general, correct?
In that facility, she became a nurse 15 years ago, went right to that facility and worked there solid for 15 years.
Wow.
Wow. And she was wearing a cloth mask for 6 weeks after, the first cases arrived in Florida. So I guess it would have been, 5 weeks. 5 weeks after the virus arrived in Florida, they still had cloth masks. And they also had, they were accepting rehab patients without testing them. And they were placing them in an area that was supposed to be sort of quarantined, but it's where all the staff walked in and out to punch a time card every day. So, their gowns, they said they reused gowns over and over again, masks, that kind of thing. Right. I mean, it was just, of course, at the time, a lot of people, it was a new thing, the coronavirus. So you have to give a little bit of, I don't know what, that this was all new to everybody. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. This was new to everybody. But some places really clamp down. For example, my father's facility did not have a case until July. So they were able to, thwart it entering. They took serious precautions. And this facility, for example, an inspector arrived in late April, and there was a table with somebody taking people's temperatures at the door. And the woman handed him a thermometer with exposed probes. And the inspector was like, we need another thermometer. So she pulled out one of those handheld ones.
Right.
And it recorded a temperature of 95.4 degrees. And then the worker acknowledged that, that it was broken. And so, and then there was inside, there were people who were not washing their shields correctly. By this time, everybody was wearing shields. They were ordered to wear, the proper equipment. And they were still people with cloth masks in, despite the fact that, N95s have been ordered. And so, I'm sorry, I just got distracted.
Oh, that's
somebody.
Okay, that's all right.
Yeah. But anyway, so this day that these inspectors arrive is the exact day that Marjorie dies, and others have already died. So, there's still, even though there's death there and people are dying there, they're still not quite taking care of things there. They're not making efforts there,
Mm-hmm.
The right efforts anyway. There's not enough leadership, I guess, to say, hey, this should be, we should have, correct working thermometers at the front door at the very least, right? I mean, the assistant director of nursing reused gloves with hand sanitizer, and, the CDC says no reusing gloves. So just different things like that.
Wow, my goodness me. Whoa, and in a few moments, we're going to really get to some of the things that just will horrify people who read your story. I mean, I think it's important, though, that, again, I want to say this for the people listening. It is very important to be in touch with these stories and read them and really process them. We live in this very fast food world of social media, which can be very toxic. And quite frankly, the 24-hour cable news cycle can fall victim to this too sometimes, or in more than one occasion, because they traffic in sound bites and numbers on a screen that flash, and Dow Jones on the right hand side, and then above that you've got the number of people who die. And that's, anyway, I don't want to go off track too much, but the point I'm trying to make is that reading a story like this that Leonora has written along with her two colleagues is really important. And that's why we're going through this for the next few minutes, so that you get a glimpse of what you're going to see when you read this story. And to that end, Leonora, because there was one thing I want to get to where I think you cite, if I remember correctly when I read it, there were 95 deaths early on or at present, and 40% of them came from one of these facilities. Am I getting that right, or can you correct me on that?
So in the state of Florida, 40% of all deaths have occurred in nursing homes.
Wow.
Right. So the majority of our not the majority, but a large portion of our deaths are attributed to nursing homes. And here in Pinellas County, there's been about between 900 and 1,000 deaths. That's the county where Seminole Pavilion is located, and 2 out of 3 are associated with nursing homes. We are a particularly hard hit area in terms of nursing homes, and it just sweeps through. And in fact, it's swept through yet again recently in the fall. At one of the homes in Freedom Square, 22 staffers tested positive a few weeks ago. So, it just feels really difficult to keep it out of these places, even when people try. But when you don't try, oh my God, it's it's really bad. Not when you don't try, but when you don't do the right things. Some experts that I talked to, said that in some respects, nursing homes kind of have to become like hospitals at this stage. They have to take that kind of care in order to protect these residents, and that's not an easy transition for these homes. Their staffing is not up to what hospitals are. All those types of things. So it's a tough thing no matter what way you look at it, and it's a really tough decision for family members to make about these facilities. What do you do with your family member? It's just, you're trying to protect them. You think that they're going to be protected in there, and you worry all the time. And then some are protected and some aren't, so anyways.
Yeah, no, and one other thing I wanted to just add that I found very poignant and touching about all of these stories, and we're going to get into just a couple more, so because I do think it's important to cover them, is the photographs, the artifacts, particularly again, Marjorie Blackman. There's a photo of her and her RN stamp or her RN badge, and a couple of other artifacts that summarize what you and your writers and your colleagues have expressed about her in the story you wrote. And I found that particularly touching, as did I find that with other people that you put their photos there and had this explanation. And one of those people is the next person, Thomas Minichillo. I hope I'm pronouncing his last name correctly. But can you talk a little bit about what happened to him?
So Thomas Minichillo was a 74-year-old postal worker. He had a lot of health problems, pneumonia, ended up in the hospital, and then ended up in Freedom Square sometime in late March. So his wife and he were very, very close, and they talked every day. And then one day the workers said, "Oh, he's too tired. He can't come to the phone now." And so then the next day, same thing. And Mrs. Minichillo and her son kept calling, and they couldn't get a hold of him. They actually went to the window. He'd been moved. And they've learned that he was placed with a roommate. And at some point on April 5th, he was sent to the hospital in an altered mental state. And he tested positive April 9th, and he died April 10th. He'd been married to his wife for 59 years. And one of the last things she remembered him saying was, "I just want to come home and have dinner with you." So he dies on April 10th. Marjorie Blackman, who we just talked to, went to work April 9th, April 10th, and April 11th is when she arrives and, has like a slight fever. It takes a week for the facility to tell anybody. The following Friday, April 17th, is the first time anybody knows anybody's died. And most families learn that people have tested positive for the first time at that point in time. So the workers find out the Monday after. They find out that 10 people have tested positive, but they don't find out that anybody's died. And they're suddenly switched from cloth masks the Friday before, the day he dies, to N95s, shields, gowns, gloves. Everything changes overnight at that point in time. So anyways, that's Mr. Minichillo's story. He was the first one. And, it's not really, he was in rehab. It seems like it started in rehab, but it could have come from an employee, or it could have come from one of the rehab patients coming from the hospital. They were coming from multiple hospitals. They weren't testing them for COVID. So, I mean, you can see that the path in was available,
Yes, and oh my goodness, it just feels to me when I was reading through this story, and I think I'm going to make this next there's one other person, but I think this story is one that people should hear before they read your story. This Freedom Square was so callous. I mean, that's probably the nicest way I can put it. In my judgment of them, as an investigative reporter, I guess you probably avoid making too many judgments. So I'm not going to ask you to render any. But one of the things I do want to mention, Leonora, to back up what I just said about making that judgment from my own personal view, is the story of Donald Jack, because that story, you can tell that better than I. So could you please tell listeners about Donald Jack?
Sure. So, I wrote this story with my colleagues, Catherine Varn and Kavitha Sarana. And Catherine spoke to Donald Jack. And so Donald Jack was a lifelong Cubs fan. And his son walks up to the facility in the middle of the week, sort of after the week after Marjorie Blackman goes into the goes in and has a temperature. He goes in and he sees all these ambulances pulling up, people in hazmat gear, and he runs to the front door and he says, "Is this COVID? What's going on?" And they say, "We don't know." And so, he calls. He tries to talk to his dad. He can't get a hold of him. He tries to get nurses, can't get a hold of them. And so finally, somebody tells him, his son calls. Donald Jack calls his son and says, "Hey, I just heard the nurses talking, and I think I'm positive. I think they were talking about me." And then soon after, the son tries to contact the facility, can't get any information, is texting back and forth with an employee. The employee says, "I'm sorry, I can't help." And then the next day, his dad is taken out to the hospital. He tests positive and he dies a week or two later. His son had wanted to actually take him out of the hospital at the outset, but they wouldn't let him because he was worried about it. So, I think, and the son, of course, like many children, of people who have died in this, there's a lot of guilt with children and did you do the right thing? You know what I mean? Like, I can totally connect with that.
Mm-hmm.
It's really a tough thing any way you look at it. But yeah, he just had a great relationship with his dad, and he just wanted to try and help him, and he wishes that the facility had let him know sooner, that this was going on there.
Right. And I remember when I read it, his son had texted someone and they replied, "Well, these things are blown out of proportion." I'm basically paraphrasing the response. The texter, the employee, the person at the facility was texting him back, "Well, this is overblown. Don't worry." Right? I'm on the right track with that, right?
About we're not all bad here. We're not bad people. But I can't help you. So I know, you know what I mean? I don't know, maybe you should come to the facility and see and talk to people yourself. Because I can't get any information for you or whatever. So yeah, it's hard,
Very, very institutional failures. I mean, to me, it's just very clear. And I think, and again, I know that you can't editorialize or say anything about this, but I will. The governor of the state of Florida is given this very, I wouldn't say colorful nickname, but it is a fashionable nickname. Ron Death Santis is the name that he's given. And I just think that there's a massive failure of leadership. I think there's a massive institutional failure. I know there's 2 lawsuits at least that you talk about in this story that all 3 of you write about. Christopher Pugh is one of the people who, or the estate of him, have flat out said, you're putting profits ahead of people. And, for me, from my point of view, it's a failure of, quite frankly, an economic system called capitalism that puts profits over people, and an institutional failure. And it really galls me. I don't want to rant and vent. We only have a couple more minutes at this point.
Well, I can add two details.
Sure.
So the governor would not give us the names of nursing homes that had positive cases or deaths for quite a number of months. In fact, the end of April was when we were the state's newspapers had to file suit against the state in order to find out, how many people were dying or testing positive. And then only then did they do it. And with regard to those admits, the people who were being admitted from the hospital without testing, nursing homes and even some state officials were worried about that in early March, like mid-March. There was hey, what about these people? Shouldn't they be tested before they're coming back to the facilities, or shouldn't we stop the flow of patients or something? And it wasn't until early May that the governor ordered 2 tests before somebody leaves a hospital and can go to a nursing home. So you got 2 months of people flowing into these places. So those are that's the two, things that happened that I think, contributed to this. I mean, if you had shut down, if you had informed people earlier, people could have made decisions, that kind of thing. If you had stopped the admissions, maybe they could have controlled it, that kind of thing. So
absolutely. And one last thing about that, when you mentioned that he was blocking all of this, so he was blocking things, the governor was blocking things, and the papers had to sue. I think in terms of the numbers of people infected and things like that, I think of and I forget her last name now, Rebecca, I believe it was her first name, who got fired. I really wish I remembered her name, but
Jones, I think it's Rebecca Jones.
Thank you. Like that is exactly who it is.
Okay.
Thank you for that's her, Rebecca Jones, who got fired because she refused to fudge the numbers. She refused to, and then she still, and I think to this very day, still actually puts the numbers out. And yesterday, and you don't have to respond to this, it's just me telling the listeners this. Yesterday, and she posted this on Twitter, did Rebecca Jones, there was a home invasion by police. Put a gun to her face, and people stormed into her home and put a gun to... This is just... There's something really, quite frankly, Gestapo-like about this. And again, you don't have to editorialize or say anything. I'm just saying this for the listeners. People listening to this have to really understand. I would actually invite people to go, and I'll put a link to her Twitter page, and so you can see that video. It's an outrage. And then it goes along, Leonora, with what you're saying about what's happened in these facilities, and it really didn't have to be this way. I think the last thing I wanted to ask you about is you mentioned at the top of this your own father, who I would like you to say a few words about, please, in connection to this and this personal story for you covering this.
Right. So as I said earlier, I wanted to find out about COVID, and so I was drawn to stories about nursing homes very early on, and then ultimately COVID got into my father's facility in July. And although my father, they gave him remdesivir, and they were going to give him the plasma, and he seemed to do better with that, but he had a heart attack and he died. And COVID was the cause, listed as the cause of death. So I lost my father, who I was very close with. We went to dinner, 4 nights a week, typically. We really enjoyed our time together. He really wanted to live, the fact that he got it after 4 or 5 months, he got it, there's been these waves. So there was the early wave, then there was the July wave. He he got hit in the July wave. And I remember, looking at the numbers right before he got it and watching like the neighborhoods. By this time, they had like maps that showed numbers and by zip code and so forth. And watching those neighborhoods right around where his place was, the numbers increasing, and you could see it. And then boom, all of a sudden, employee within it tests positive. Boom, another employee tests positive. A resident tests positive. It's just, you could just see it merging in, and I was caught. I was just like, what do I do? But if I bring him home, what if I give it to him? I just couldn't, it was too fast. And within somebody getting like a week, my dad had it, so it was really sad for me losing him like that, and not being able to see him. That was the other thing I really learned from this. This isolation that, it's such a difficult thing to put people, to keep people isolated from their loved ones like that when they're that old. I mean, the loved ones are what keep them going, and, I could see, I was trying to talk to him on the phone every day. And I could see that that it was having this huge impact on him, not being able to see his family. And so it's a hard way to lose him. He's a really good guy. He was, great father. So,
Leonora, I am so sorry for your loss. I really am. I really do send you personally my deepest, most heartfelt condolences. As you've so clearly pointed out, when you're close, you've got a loved one, a father who you really bond with, you're close to, and he's gone, and not being able to really say goodbye. It's heartbreaking. And I'm sure that all the listeners would join me in wishing you most heartfelt condolences. I'm very sorry for your loss.
Thank you so much.
You're most welcome. Coping must be very difficult. You're into this story, and there's really no time for you to really have a moment for yourself, perhaps. But I do want to thank you so very much, Leonora LaPeter Anton, the Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist for the Tampa Bay Times. Her story, along with two other writers that she mentioned, the story is Death at Freedom Square. I will link to that for this episode of the Politicrat podcast. And also, I believe you're on social media as well, on Twitter. I'm sure they can find you there.
At writer Leonora.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
At writer Leonora.
Very important, yes. I'll link to that as well. But thank you for mentioning that too. And thank you very much for your time talking about this story. We really do have to be aware and really get in touch with the fact that this is going on, that there are real people behind numbers. And thank you for your time and talking about some of the people that you chronicled. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening.
Very special thanks to Leonora LaPeter Anton, the Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter at the Tampa Bay Times, for her time talking about this very important, very powerful, and very necessary story that you really must read. I will link to it on the liner notes of this episode of the podcast. And don't forget, you can get in touch with Leonora on Twitter as well, and I will post a link to her Twitter page. Writer Leonora, I believe, is the Twitter handle, but I will make sure that is linked in the liner notes of the podcast episode. We really need to treat each other like human beings. And that's one thing that I didn't mention in our conversation, but we really need to be humane toward each other. And a system of, quite frankly, a system of capitalism, which is all about, when capitalism capitalism should exist. I'm not saying it shouldn't, But what I am saying is that there is capitalism that absolutely kills the soul and just destroys people in service of profit. And in many ways, that's inherently what capitalism is, particularly the toxic brand of capitalism that does this. And you see the end result, and that is Freedom Square and the indifference of people who run that place. I should add, by the way, that Leonora's story, along with the two other writers that she mentioned who wrote this story with her and did the investigative reporting of the story, tried to reach out to the executive director of Freedom Square, and he wanted their questions in advance. When he got the questions, he declined to send written answers to them and instead issued a statement. The statement, and I'm paraphrasing, said that we care about the people who come here to Freedom Square. Please read this very important story, and you can judge for yourself whether or not that statement is true. Thank you very much for listening to this edition of The Politicrat. I'm Omar Moore.